Imagine a loaf of bread that could tell a story. Not just any story, but one about status, survival, and centuries of human ingenuity. Now close your eyes for a moment and picture it, a dense, dark loaf, resting on a wooden table in a medieval cottage. Its crust is thick, uneven, maybe even cracked, but inside it holds the promise of life through long winters and harsh seasons. Sounds a little different from the soft white bread you see in modern bakeries, does it not? Before we dive into the story behind every slice, I invite you to pause for a second. If you enjoy exploring these hidden corners of history with me, take a moment to like this video, maybe subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, or even the strangest loaf of bread you've ever eaten. Let us keep the lights low, maybe turn on a gentle fan for a soft hum, and step quietly into the medieval kitchen together. Now let us start with something many people misunderstand. Not all bread was the same in medieval Europe. Your social rank, your wealth. Even your location could determine whether your bread was white and soft or dark, dense and heavy enough to make you wonder if it could double as a doorstop. Fine wheat bread was the luxury of nobles, the kind chroniclers described with admiration, often baked in private ovens and served with feasts. Meanwhile, peasants relied on rye, barley, oats or mixtures called maslin bread. These loaves were filling and hardy, often containing bran or husks to stretch scarce flour, and their colour and texture reflected both necessity and social position. It is fascinating to consider that bread was not merely food, it was a statement. In some villages in England, records from the 13th century note explicitly that white bread is for the lords, brown for the commons. The peasants understood that their bread was life itself, but also a subtle reminder of the world they lived in. And yet even these heavy, humble loaves were carefully crafted, skillfully baked and deeply valued. So as we lift this imagined loaf from the table, feel the weight in your hands. This is more than flour and water. It is history, it is culture, it is resilience baked into every crumb. And it is just the beginning of the story we're about to uncover. Next, let us step closer to the fire and see how these loaves were made and the incredible skill and care that went into every batch shaping survival and daily life across medieval Europe. And while the shape and colour of bread could reveal your place in society, the real magic happened long before it reached the table. Making bread in medieval Europe was not a simple matter of mixing flour and water. It was a delicate dance of skill, timing and patience. Grain had to be milled sometimes by hand or in small village mills, then carefully kneaded into dough. The rising process relied on wild yeast sourdough and could take hours, even a full day, depending on the temperature and moisture. Too short and the loaf would be dense and hard to chew. Too long and it could turn sour, almost inedible. Imagine balancing all of that with no precise thermometer or modern appliances in a chilly stone cottage during winter. Many communities shared a communal oven, which meant families queued for their turn, sometimes for hours. Archaeologists studying 13th century London have found evidence of these ovens showing heavy wear from generations of constant baking. And mistakes were more than inconvenient, they could be disastrous. Rye contaminated with ergot fungus could lead to hallucinations or even poisoning, while poorly stored flour could sprout mould or spoil completely. A single loaf could mean the difference between a hearty meal and a hungry evening. Yet despite these challenges, medieval bakers developed remarkable skill. They knew how to coax flavour and texture from humble ingredients. Even peasants with their coarse rye or barley could produce bread that was edible, sustaining and sometimes even comforting. It was not luxury, it was mastery of survival. Have you ever considered how much work goes into the bread you take for granted today? Now imagine doing all of this in the middle of winter with only a wooden paddle, a clay oven, and a handful of yeast from last week's dough. That is patience, ingenuity, and resilience baked into every loaf. And as these loaves cooled, filling the cottage with their warm, yeasty aroma, they were ready to become the centerpiece of the daily meal, the very foundation of life itself. Next, we will explore how bread shaped the daily diet, providing not just calories, but the sustenance and energy that kept medieval communities alive through harsh seasons. and once the bread was baked, it became the centerpiece of daily life. For peasants, bread was more than a food, it was fuel. A slice of dense rye or barley bread could sustain a labourer through long hours in the fields, carrying water, tending animals, or ploughing frozen soil. Studies of skeletal remains from medieval villages in England and France show strong bones evidence of heavy work, yet also signs of occasional nutritional stress, proof that bread was essential, but not always sufficient. Meals were simple. Pottage, a thick stew of beans, onions, leeks, and sometimes a bit of salted meat accompanied bread. Ale or small beer often washed it down, providing hydration and extra calories. Children too drank weak beer as water was not always safe. Imagine a child learning to chew this heavy, sometimes tough bread, sip the sour ale and carry on with chores. Survival depended on these small repetitive routines, on this unglamorous but vital sustenance. It is easy to underestimate the importance of bread in this context. Modern life offers abundant supermarkets, delivery and processed snacks. But for medieval communities, bread was the foundation. Without it, work faltered, hunger spread, and the fragile balance of daily life collapsed. Even small variations in flour quality or baking success could ripple across the household for days. Yet there was resilience. Families learned to stretch a loaf, to combine it with legumes or vegetables to make every crumb count. They were resourceful and disciplined. And there was humour too, a child biting a crust too hard or a sibling sneaking the last slice. Life went on bread in hand in a rhythm dictated by labour seasons and necessity. As the smell of fresh bread filled the home, it was a reminder that survival depended not just on work or skill, but on consistency. The bread of yesterday fed the bodies of today, while the promise of tomorrow's loaf sustained hope. Next, we will see how bread was intertwined not only with daily survival, but also with faith and celebration, shaping rituals, festivals, and the very heartbeat of medieval community life. But bread in medieval Europe was never just about filling stomachs. It carried meaning, ritual, and even a touch of celebration. Religious observances shaped when and how bread was eaten. During Lent, meat was forbidden, so bread, often paired with fish, became the centerpiece of the meal. In monasteries, fish ponds were carefully maintained to provide sustenance for fasting days. Even in small villages, families adhered to these rhythms, marking their calendars with holy days where bread took on a sacred role. And then there were the festivals. Christmas, Easter, and local saints' days brought special breads rich with eggs, honey or fruit, a stark contrast to the everyday coarse rye or barley loaves. Pachal bread for Easter, shaped and decorated in symbolic forms, told a story of faith and community, turning a simple loaf into an object of reverence. It was a reminder that food was never just survival, it was culture, identity and connection. Do you ever think about how much our own meals carry meaning today? For medieval people, each loaf could be a statement of devotion, celebration, or social belonging. Even the act of sharing bread was powerful, binding family, neighbours, and community in invisible threads of tradition. The smell of a festive loaf, baking the ritual of slicing it, carefully passing pieces to neighbours or family. These were moments of warmth and joy, fleeting but deeply human. Bread bridged the gap between survival and expression, proving that even in a hard world, humanity found a way to celebrate life. And as these special loaves cooled and the household shared their simple feast, they reinforced the same lesson every day: survival was important, but so was connection. Next, we will uncover how the myths about medieval bread, its supposed tastelessness and ubiquity, compare to reality, and what lessons modern life can learn from these humble, life-sustaining loaves. And now let us take a closer look at the stories and myths surrounding medieval bread, because what most people think they know is often far from the truth. Many imagine medieval bread as uniformly hard, tasteless, and barely edible, a symbol of poverty and struggle. Yet historical records and archaeological evidence tell a different story. Bread varied greatly in quality, flavour and purpose. Even among peasants, bakers carefully balanced grains, adjusted fermentation, and paired loaves with whatever vegetables, legumes or small amounts of meat were available. Far from being monotonous, it was a creative and practical response to scarcity. Chroniclers from 13th century France noted that each village has its own bread, its own taste, highlighting how local grain water and technique shape distinct flavours. Bread was also a tool of ingenuity. Husks, bran and mixed grains allowed families to stretch limited supplies while still producing edible and sustaining loaves. In some regions, a single week's harvest could be transformed into bread that fed a household for days or even weeks, with remarkable efficiency. And yes, mistakes happened. A loaf could burn or sour or attract pests. But these challenges fostered resilience. People learned to adapt to respect ingredients and to value every crumb. It was both survival and subtle artistry. Does this make you rethink the next slice of bread you eat? In a way, every loaf carried the weight of culture, technique, and human perseverance. Medieval bread was not just food. It was history you could hold in your hands, a story of resourcefulness baked into every bite. As we reflect on these lessons, we see that bread connects us across time. It reminds us to appreciate what we have, to honour labour and craft, and to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. And with that, we can savour the full picture of medieval life, where even something as humble as bread tells the story of resilience, community and hope. Next, we will wrap up this journey drawing together the truths and surprises we've discovered about medieval bread and reflect on what it can teach us today. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through medieval bread, it is worth pausing to reflect on what these humble loaves truly represent. Bread was never merely sustenance. It was survival, creativity, community and culture all needed together. From the hard, dense rye of peasant households to the fragrant golden wheat of noble tables, every loaf carried a story of the hands that worked the fields, of the skill that transformed grain into nourishment, and of the resilience that allowed people to endure long winters and uncertain harvests. Consider this: a single loaf might feed a family through days of toil, accompany a child to school, or mark a feast day with ritual and celebration. In a world without refrigerators or supermarkets, bread was life itself, portable, reliable and versatile. Archaeological studies of medieval settlements such as those in York and Paris show the careful use of grain, the variety of loaves, and even the communal ovens that shaped village life. Each crumb reflected knowledge passed down through generations, the patience of daily labour, and the ingenuity of ordinary people confronting the harsh realities of their time. And yet there is something deeply human in the imperfections of this bread, the slightly sour taste of over-fermented dough, the occasional rock-hard crust, or the creative use of bran and husks. These were not flaws, but lessons in adaptability, reminding us that necessity often breeds innovation. Medieval bread, in its simplicity and complexity, teaches us to appreciate the ordinary, to honour effort, and to see history not just in grand castles and battles, but in the everyday acts that sustain life. So the next time you slice your loaf at breakfast, imagine the journey it took from field to flour, from oven to table, from hands long gone to yours today. History is alive in that moment, quietly reminding us that even the most mundane objects can carry profound meaning. Thank you for walking this path with me, for taking the time to explore the hidden world behind a simple loaf. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply reflect on the extraordinary in your everyday meals. And remember, the world of history is vast and full of surprises. There is always another story waiting to be uncovered. I cannot wait to share it with you next time. So keep your curiosity alive, keep your imagination warm, and let the ordinary become extraordinary once more.